Hi, this is Bob from INSYDIUM. In this video, we'll break down this crystal spawning scene. We'll be using xParticles, NeXus, and then finally some Cycles 4D rendering techniques. So let's get started. In our scene then, we have this default TerraformFX terrain set up, and this is what we're going to use as our surface. But look, we can get rid of this TF grid and this hydraulic erosion operator. We don't need those. And in our TF terrain, let's go and disable the gradient display because we're not going to be using those colors anyway. Just make a bit of room here. And let's go and also we'll deactivate our lighting settings. Let's disable the lights. We don't need those for now. Now we're going to be making 3 different versions of this terrain. One's going to be high res for rendering. So let's do that one first. We'll go to basic and rename this one render. And in the render one, in the object tab, we're going to move down to where we sort out how many polygons this is made from the segments look, and we'll bump it up to say 1500 by 1500, which will give us lots more detail, especially in these noisy bits here. Excellent. So now that we've done that, let's go. Actually, we're going to change this noise. In the default setup, the noise, if we go to the properties, it's using the stupable noise type. You can make this whatever you want, but I'm going to go with a wavy turbulence and then just going to cycle through a couple of seeds till I get something I like the look of. Maybe that one. Okay, so this is our render terrain. Now we're going to make a copy because this is the render one is very high poly, which gives us lots of detail. But if we're using xParticles and NeXus tools, which has to calculate the polygons, it'll be a lot slower to calculate because it's so high res. And we don't need it to be for those calculations. So let's, in our copy, let's call this one terrain, and we're going to call this one terrain sim, and then high. And the reason we're calling it high, I'll explain in a bit. So this is a sim one, so we want this to be way lower poly. So let's go down to our object tab, and where we set those segments, let's reduce this way down to say just 100 segments in the X and the Z. And if we just make that render one invisible, you'll see that we've got a much smoother looking terrain, and that's because if we show the lines, NB, it's way lower poly, but the undulations are in the same kind of place and the same shape because it's driven by exactly the same noise. Excellent. So we've called this one high because we are maintaining this level of undulations going up and down. But we're actually going to create a one that has the same shape, but they don't jut up as high or go down as low. And I'll explain why in a bit. So to make that one, look, let's make another duplicate and call this one terrain sim, and we'll change it from high to low. And we're going to make these not undulate as much by just going into the noise settings to the operator tab. I'm just going to reduce the gain. Let's half it. Let's put 25 centimeters. Okay. So if I then move the low one up just so we can see both, you'll see, look, here's the low one that has the same shaped undulations, but they don't go up and down as much. And here is the high one where they do go up and down more. And the reason we've done that, I'm going to hit NA to hide those lines. And just so you can visually see why we have done this and the effect it's going to give us, I'm going to get our low one. Let's go to the basic tab, display color, change it to custom, and just make it black so there's a real contrast. And then with the sim low, we're going to move it down until it's kind of intersecting a bit with the higher undulations. So there we're getting this nice kind of intersecting. And this is going to make, we're doing this at this stage right at the beginning, but this is going to give us a really nice rendering effect with some light that we're going to be shining. And that's why we've got 2, but it'll become clear later on. But basically, we've got them intersecting. Excellent. Right, we can make our high sim terrain invisible for now, and we'll just have a look at our low one. Excellent. Right, let's get on with the particle simulation then. So we're going to go to INSYDIUM, xParticles, System. Bring in this new system. And we can get all of our terrain objects, and let's just put them in the Utilities folder to stay nice and organized. Now in our system, we bring in this default emitter. It happens automatically. I'm just going to lift it up. We've got this square emitter firing out these particles. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to position this square emitter to the side of our terrain, and then we want to make it nice and wide. Doesn't need to be that high. Lift it up a little bit. Cool. So there is our emitter, and we want a shot of particles. So let's go to the emitter, emission tab, and in the emission type we will change it from rate to shot. We don't need many. Let's put maybe, I don't know, 30 particles. And if we hit play, you'll see, yep, there's our shot of particles. Now let's change a couple of things. We don't actually want our particles to be born really close to each other, and we can avoid that by clicking this button here, no intersection, within a radius of, say, I don't know, 13. So it's just saying that if any two particles are born within 13 centimeters of each other at their birth point, one of them will be deleted. So there's no intersecting going on. So that's just going to ensure we don't have too many that are very close to each other. We could maybe even up that to 16 centimeters just to be sure. And now they're nicely spaced out. Okay? Let's make these particles a bit bigger just so we can see them. It doesn't matter, we're not going to be rendering these, but just to make it a bit more obvious, let's go to the display tab and we'll change it to, let's change it to arrows filled. And just so we can see them moving, because we're going to be changing the direction in a bit, let's go to the extended data tab and we will use rotation. And the rotation we're going to choose is tangential, so they're always pointing in the direction of travel. Okay, so there are our arrow particles. Excellent. Now we want these to follow the surface of our terrain sim low terrain. So we'll do that with a modifier. Let's go to the modifiers menu, motion modifiers, and we'll bring in an xpFollowSurface. Now this is asking which surface do you want them to follow. We want it to follow the terrain sim low, but because this is a generator object, we need to put it in a join first for it to work. So let's go to utilities, and in the utilities options, we can bring in an XP join. There it is. Let's drag in our terrain sim low, and let's just rename this join sim low. And then because we put it in the join, we need to now change its color. Let's put display color custom, just make it black, just so it was the same as what it was before. Great. So now what we're able to do is we can put this object in our follow surface. So let's go to the follow surface settings, object tab. And now we can drag our join sim low into the object. Let's put the pull up to 99%. And if we hit play now, some of these particles are going to follow along the surface. Yeah, look, some of them are and some of them aren't. And the reason the higher ones aren't kind of being grabbed on the surface is that the distance is only set at 10 centimeters. So they'll only follow the surface and be pulled along its surface if they are within 10 centimeters. So let's just whack this up. So they're all definitely being pulled along. Yep. Excellent. Now, what we want to do is, they're all kind of, well, a lot of them, because of the undulations, are congregating down here. So what we could do is we could add another modifier to force them to kind of be pulled in this direction. So let's go to modifiers, motion modifiers. Let's bring in an attractor. We'll move the attractor over here. And let's maybe put our acceleration down to 50. And let's just see what we get. Hit play. Yeah, and look, they're all being pulled in that direction. Okay, we could even reduce the strength of that and maybe reduce the acceleration down a bit. Let's have a look. That's looking good. And we could also, look, let's go to our emitter, emission tab. Let's add a bit of variation in that speed. So in the speed, they're going at 150. Let's put 60 variation in that. So we're going to get differing speeds. Yeah, that's looking really nice. Excellent. So now what we're going to do, let's go back to that attractor actually, and just we can uncheck visible in editor, which gets rid of that icon. We don't need to look at that now. Now we're going to draw a trail behind these particles. So we'll go to generators. Let's just close up that join so it's a bit more tidy. In fact, we can close up that utilities folder as well. So in generators, let's go to XP trail. The trail says which emitter do you want to use to create your trails. So let's drag in this emitter. Now when we hit play, yeah, we're getting these trails. Excellent. Now what we want to do now is we want to, you can see where particles are intersecting each other's path. We want them, instead of being able to do this, we want them to freeze so they don't cross the trails. So to do that, we're going to use an avoid modifier. So let's go to modifiers, motion modifiers, avoid. Now we need to do two things here. We need to say which object do you want the particles to avoid. So let's drag in our trail. And then we need to say what do you want to do when you have detected that you are going to intersect. And these are the different options that we can do on detection. Change direction, freeze, die, or trigger an action. We just want to freeze. So let's click on freeze, hit play. And yeah, look, see them freezing? Perfect. Okay, so that's looking good. So now we have got our basic simulation of our particle system sorted. Let's go to this emitter. Let's go to the basic tab and we'll change the name and just call it emitter control. We are not going to be rendering these particles. We are just using this to kind of set up the basic control elements of our sim, which is going to be spawning some crystals. Excellent. So now we have got that done, what we need to do is look at setting up these crystal spawning particles. So to do that, let's go to our utilities. Let's open this up. And what we want to do is we're going to start using our terrain sim high terrain now. So I'm just going to activate that again. And we need to put this one inside a join because we're going to be using this for simulation purposes as well. So let's go to the utilities folder, object tab. We'll bring in another XP join. Let's rename this one as well. So we'll call this sim high. And then we can put our terrain sim high inside that. And then we can use this for simulation purposes as well. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to spawn particles behind these control ones. And we're going to do that using a NeXus question. So let's go to NeXus object. We're going to choose a NeXus object, which is going to be an NX question. Let's bring that in. And what we're going to do is we actually don't need to ask a question to trigger the spawning of these particles. We just want them to spawn immediately. So what we can do is just directly put in an action. We don't need this to be a set action. We don't want to set the color or the speed or the radius. We want to spawn. So let's change this from set to spawn. There we go. And it's saying what emitter do you want to use. So we need to create a new spawning emitter, and we can do that easily by just clicking this add emitter. So let's do that. And I'm going to put that emitter in our emitters folder, and let's rename it immediately to emitter crystals. Okay, and let's go back to our NX question object tab. So what we want to do is we want to maybe spawn 5 particles a frame. And if we just hit play now, you'll see that we're getting spawned particles. There's a few problems though. They've got kind of speed and they're moving along the surface of our terrain. So that's because they are being affected by all of these modifiers. And we don't want the crystal ones to be affected by those. So let's go to the emitter crystals, modifiers tab, and we want to exclude all of these modifiers. So let's just take the picker and click on the follow surface, the attractor, and the avoid. So it's just going to ignore all of those. And now we've just got these particles moving off, but they've got velocity at birth. They've got this random speed look, and we want them to be static. So let's go to our NX question. Let's go down to the settings. And what we can say is don't inherit the parent particle settings. Let's just set them. So we're going to have, we can do all of the particle settings here. So full life, yes. Velocity, well, it's irrelevant because we're going to give them no speed, and we're going to give them, well, actually, we'll leave the radius at 5 for now, but we are going to put this on 0 and control their radius with a modifier. But now if we hit play, you can see, yes, look, we've just got static particles. Excellent. So what we want to do is we want a spread of this particles. At the moment, we only have a spread of 2 centimeters from where the source particle was when they were born. And we want that to be a bigger spread. So let's put this on, say, 17 centimeters. Hit play. And there we go. So that's good. Now, we want this lateral spread of on the Z and the X axis, because that's going to be how we get these nice paths of crystals. But we don't want, if I move the camera, we don't want this vertical spread. So how are we going to get these particles to be stuck to the surface of our terrain? Well, we're going to use another follow surface to kind of snap them on. But this time, we're going to snap them onto the sim high, the surface with all of the nice big undulations. So let's take our original follow surface, copy it, and in this one, we will, let's just rename it and call it follow surface crystals. Okay, and we'll go into the settings, we'll take out the sim low terrain, and we'll put in the sim high. Now, there's one thing we need to do here. We don't want our original control particles to be affected by this follow surface on the sim high. We want them to ignore it. So let's go to the emitter control, modifiers, and just drag in the new follow surface just so they're discluded from it. And let's have a look, hit play. Okay, yeah, so now you can see, look, they're being born and then they're getting snapped to the surface of our sim high, which is what we want. Okay, very nice. So let's just make both of these terrains invisible so we can see what's happening here. So there are our particles moving, and we've got these are going to be our crystals. So what we could do is, actually there's one thing that's happening here. Can you see that when the particles are frozen, they're still emitting new crystals? And actually, we want that to stop. We want them to stop spawning when the particle has frozen. So we can do that with another question. Let's go to our NX question. And what we're going to do is hold control to deselect spawn particles. And we're going to add a question. And the question is going to be not if the particle age, we're going to ask, has the particle frozen? And to ask that question, being frozen is a type of particle flag. So let's change the data type from age to flags. And then look here, frozen. If the particle is frozen, then do something. And the thing we want to do is to stop this kind of question from being asked. We want to break the question cycle. So to do that, we'll add an action, and the action isn't to set color. We want to break the question cycle. So it'll just stop doing the question, it'll stop the spawn. So let's have a look, hit play. Yep, so look, now when the particles are frozen, it's stopped spawning. Perfect. All right, so now that we have got that, let's make these look a little bit more crystal-like. So we'll go to our emitter crystals, display, and instead of displaying the squares, let's just display boxes filled, which aren't going to look perfectly crystal-like, but for now, until we start doing our render instances, it'll be fine. So now we're getting these boxes of crystals, but we want them to grow up over time. We don't want them just to snap on. So the way we'll do that is with another modifier. Let's go to NeXus and we'll bring in an nxScale modifier. And in the Object tab, we want to change the particle radius, yes, but we're not going to use this change value over time. We're going to set the value. Let's set the value at something like, I don't know, 4.5 maybe. So now if we hit play, all of those particles are just born and they are 4.5. We want them to grow up to 4.5 over a certain amount of frames. So we can do that with some mapping. So let's go to the mapping tab. And we want to add a mapping layer, and we want it to be the particle age. We could choose any of these particle properties, but we're going to map the radius value to the age of the particle. So let's bring in an age layer. The parameter that we want to map is that radius value. So let's find that in our list. Where is it? Radius value, there it is. And yeah, we want to map that to the age. And by default, the minimum age is set to 0 frames and the maximum age is set to 30. So this range of frames is along the x-axis of our graph here, with 0 frames at the beginning along to 30 frames. And then the y-axis of our graph is the radius value, with 1 being full radius value of 4.5 centimeters and 0 being no radius value. So what it's saying is when the particle is 0 frames old, it has no radius. And as it gets older, its radius increases and increases and increases until it gets to 30 frames old and it has the full radius value that we've set, which is 4.5 centimeters. So let's have a look. And yeah, look, they're growing up. Great. Now we want them to grow up a bit more quickly and then to kind of just sag off a little bit, so we get a bit of a kind of like almost a jiggle reaction. So we'll do that just by adjusting our graph. Look, let's pull this down first. Hold control, add a knot, ramp it up, and then maybe something like that. So it's going to really quickly ramp up to full radius, but then just tail off a bit. In fact, look, we could bring that down a bit and maybe even point that down. So now we'll get a really sudden scale, yeah, but then it kind of just springs back a little bit. Very cool. Now, there's just one issue here. If we come in a little bit closer, you're going to see that on 1 or 2 frames of when the particles are born, they may not quite be perfectly on our surface. And that's because we need to, let's just go to our follow surface crystals, and let's just put the pull on 100%. Which means that they'll just immediately be snapped to the surface of our new terrain. Yeah, excellent. Right, so now we have our crystals growing on following our sim particles. So we're at the point now where we can start doing the rendering tricks, which is going to instance our crystal geometry and make everything kind of come together. So before we do that, let's get all of this cached and then we'll be ready to render. Oh, actually, there's one more thing we need to do, almost forgot, is our trails. We actually want to create some geometry from these trails. And the geometry that we're going to create, we can actually cache that as well. So everything is cached before render time. So let's do that. What we're going to do is go to our generators menu. We're going to bring in a spline mesher. Now the spline mesher can mesh any trail, spline, whatever. So let's get our trail object and we need to put it into the splines objects window here. So let's drag in the trail. And now look, you can see we have this geometry. We don't need vertex colors or joins. Let's tick those off. And we don't need this to be as big. Let's say maybe 1.5 centimeters. So now look, we've got this geometry following our trails and we've got all of our particles. Excellent. Right, so we're ready to cache. So let's just go to our utilities. We'll bring in a cache object and let's everything in default. That's cool. I'm going to cache mine to external files. You pick an appropriate document location. Let's build the cache. So obviously it's not going to take very long. Only got 90 frames here. There's our cache done. We can make our emitter control. We can just actually switch that off now. We don't need that emitter control. And we don't need the trail anymore. And let's have a look. So now we have cached particles growing up over our terrain. We can make our terrain sim high invisible. Just switch both of those off. we can switch on our terrain render, and now we have got the full detailed terrain with our crystals growing up over the surface. And we've also got our geometry here, and this geometry we're going to be using at render time for some really cool lighting techniques. Right, so that's done. We're ready to jump into looking at the Cycles 4D settings to get this final effect. So here we are in our Cycles layout. We've got our viewport here. This is our Cycles 4D node editor where we can adjust the materials. Here is our big real-time preview, and then the rest is as normal. So what we need to do, if we hit render now, you're going to see we don't get anything at all, and that's because we have no lights in our scene. So let's bring in those lights first. We'll go to INSYDIUM, Cycles, and bring in, this is just a basic point light. Let's bring that in. Here it is in our scene. If I hit play, now we're seeing our terrain. Let's bring this one to the front. Now actually, I can see that there's a problem. This terrain looks a bit weird, and that's because we're actually rendering all of our terrain objects. So we have to make sure that these two sim terrains that we made, let's hold Control-Alt and click on the traffic lights until they are both red on both of those. Yep, and now we are just rendering our terrain render. Excellent. So that is that. I think we could perhaps move this over a bit so we've got a bit more room here. Now what I'd like to do is let's start having a look at the particles. So all we need to do to render these particles, look, we've got our emitter crystals here, and if we come to a frame where we have some particles, we're not seeing them in the real-time preview. We're seeing our spline mesher but not our particles. So let's just make that spline mesher, we'll just switch it off for now. And we want to look at these particles. So all we have to do to create particles in our Cycles 4D preview is to instance something. We use an instance tag to do that. So click on the emitter that we want to use, go to Tags, Extensions, INSYDIUM, Cycles, and then we want the instance tag. And as soon as we have that instance tag on, look, we automatically get these sphere instances on every particle, which is cool. And by default, it just uses a sphere under the hood. But we want to generate some crystal-like geometry. So you could actually use a really detailed crystal mesh that you've created here and instance one of those on every particle. But we're just going to use a very simple piece of geometry to keep things quick, and it'll still look really good. So let's go to our primitives. We're going to create our crystal, and we'll just bring in a cylinder. So here is this giant cylinder in the middle of our scene, and we can just make it from this. Let's go to the cylinder settings, object tab. We'll reduce the rotation segments to maybe 6, which gives us obviously these edges. And what we'll do is we'll make this way smaller. So look, let's make the radius 2 centimeters and the height maybe 20. So we've got this long, thin cylinder. I'm just going to dolly in so we can see that. Let's just bring it up a bit. So there is our cylinder in our scene, and here we can see it in the real-time preview. Now, it'd be nice to have a bit of a bevel on this edge here, which will help to kind of catch light at different angles and give us some glinting. So let's just go to the caps and go to the fillet. Now, the default 2 centimeters is way too big for this size cylinder, so let's put that down to maybe 0.5. Still a bit too big. 0.3. Yeah, that's better, or even we could maybe go 0.2. We just want this slightly beveled edge here, which will help catch some reflections. Excellent. So now that we've got that, look, let's dolly way back out again. We'll just put that original cylinder, just reposition it under our terrain so we're not seeing it. And now, this is the cool thing. Instead of instancing spheres on these particles, look, let's just go to our instance tag. We can drag in our cylinder into that objects list. And now we have got cylinders instead of spheres. Now, they're all a bit big at the moment, so we can go to our size multiplier, and all of these adjustments can be made at render time, even though this is a cached particle emitter. So in the size multiplier, look, let's put this down to maybe 20. Yeah, that's looking cool. And then with maybe loads of size variation, so we have lots of crystals at different sizes. Let's just come in a little bit closer. Something like that. And now look, yeah, we've got all of these instanced crystals. Now, one thing is that they're very uniform because we have no rotational variation in our particles, and as such you can see we've got no rotation variation in our instances, and we want that, especially on the heading, which would be this axis. So look, we can do that easily. If I adjust this rotation offset of the heading here, you'll see that, look, they're gradually beginning to spin round, but they're all spinning round. So look, if we put this on 360, it'll look exactly the same because we've just spun them all around 360 degrees. But now we can add 100% rotation variation, and they're all going to have different heading angles. Excellent. So now we have done that, we can do the same thing for the rotation offset of the pitch and the bank, but obviously we don't want 360 degrees. Let's just put maybe 9 degrees on both of those. Yeah, look, that's good. So now we've got these kind of jutting up at different angles, which is what we want. Excellent. So I'm just going to find a camera position that's going to look good for us and move forward a few frames. I quite like this kind of position where we have got an area of no crystals here, look, but then we've got our obvious crystals in the scene. Okay, so that's looking good, but obviously these are just looking like diffuse objects, they're not crystals, so we need to put kind of a glass type material on here. So let's go to our material manager, and on this little arrow we'll click that, cycles, and we want to bring in a surface. Now in the surface materials here we've got things like diffusion and glass and glossy. You could use this glass, but actually if you have a look in the surface extended folder, we've got this brilliant glass dispersion material, which under the hood is actually really complicated, but it's all housed within this group node here, and it's really simple. If you click inside this group, you'll see exactly how it was made, and it uses tons of nodes to create the ability to reduce the inner shadows of the glass and to work out this dispersion of light. It kind of splits the RGB, and it's very cool. But all we need to do to have this on our object is to drag it onto the object in which we are instancing. So just put it on this cylinder. And now we have got these crystals. Now, obviously, they don't look right yet. They're too... we need to put a bit of roughness in because the light's just going straight through them. So let's go to our dispersion node here. And I can either adjust the settings by using the sliders, or if we have it selected, we can go to the regular attributes manager here and make changes. You can see that the settings are the same. So let's put some roughness in, maybe 2.2. Actually, sorry, not 2.2. That'll be way too much. 0.2 roughness. Yeah, and you can see that we're starting to catch light now. Now that I've done that, we're starting to get these fireflies in the renders, these really hot spots. I'm going to show you how to sort that out in a second. But yeah, that roughness is looking okay. And then the IOR, the index of refraction, we need to put this up. Now you could look up exactly what the index of refraction is for the object you're making, whether it's crystal or whatever. But I'm just going to put something like maybe 2.2. And that's going to work for us for this. Now, as I said, this is starting to look difficult to see because we're getting all of these fireflies, and this can happen if you have very bright reflective materials with bright lights. So to solve this, we need to do a bit of clamping of the indirect and the direct light, and we do that in the render settings. It's actually dead easy. Go to render, edit render settings. We'll change the renderer to cycles, and in the cycles settings, just make a little bit of room here, we're looking for the integrator settings, and look, we have a clamp direct and a clamp indirect, and by default it's set to 0, 0, which means there's no clamping, but we want to clamp it to maybe 3 bounces for the indirect and the direct light. Let's click on that, come out of there, and yeah, so that has got rid of those fireflies, and the noise is getting more and more tidy as this is rendering through the samples. Excellent. Okay, so it's not quite looking how we want it yet, but we're starting to get our crystal-like materials. So let's do a couple of things. First of all, with our light, let's take the light and let's give it a warm colour. And this is what we're going to be using, not really to illuminate the ground as it is at the moment. We just want this to be glinting inside our crystals. So in the colour, let's give it kind of a very kind of burnt orange warm colour. Something like that maybe. Okay, that's good. And then what I want to do is I want to be able to see the light in my viewport, but I don't want to adjust this camera position of my real-time preview. So there's a really cool trick we can do to do that. If we want a cycles camera in there first, so let's go to INSYDIUM, cycles, and bring in a camera. And here it is. Let's look through the camera. And now we're looking through the camera. If I click on this button in the real-time preview, it locks the preview to that camera position. So now if I come out of that camera by clicking the white button here, I can go into my viewport, dolly out, but look, the real-time preview has stayed in the same place. So that's cool. So what I'm going to do is we're going to take our light and we're going to bring it down on the Y until the point where we're getting nice glints in our crystals, but it's not necessarily illuminating the floors much. Let's just move it back a bit as well. So something like that is looking pretty cool. I think we'll actually come up a bit now that we've moved it back. Yes, we're getting these really nice light glints and glimmers in our crystals. That's cool. What we're also going to do is duplicate this light and move one to this side of our terrain as well. So let's hold control and drag it across. And that's just going to give us some on the other side. I'm going to move that one down a bit. Now, if you've got two lights in the scene, what you want to do is you want to switch one of them off so you can see exactly what each light is contributing to the scene. Otherwise, we're just guessing. So let's switch off the original light. Yeah, so now our secondary light is giving us these glints. I think we could bring that light down a bit so it's a bit more subtle. Yeah, so we're just getting some glints on the kind of back side of those crystals. That's looking good. Let's switch that one off and switch on our other light. Yeah, so together we've got something like this. I think with our original light we could then perhaps move that down even lower again now that we've got this secondary one. Okay, so something like that, that's looking pretty cool. Now we're going to introduce some more light, and to do this we're going to use our spline mesher. So let's activate our spline mesher so it's in the scene, and what we want to do is emit light from the spline mesher, and the way we'll do that is to make an emission material. So let's go to our material manager and we'll go to cycles and we want a surface emission. And the emission we're going to put on the spline mesher. And look, straight away we are illuminating everything really. It's really kind of made this scene pop. A little bit too much, admittedly, at the moment. What we want to do is we want to illuminate the floor. We want this to be seen inside the crystals and to kind of reflect and refract in those. But we don't want to actually see it. We just want to see the effects of it. So to do that, we'll go to our spline mesher, go to the tags, extensions, INSYDIUM, cycles, and we want an object tag. And here inside the object tag, we can say, look, don't be seen by the camera. There we go. So that's looking way better. Now, the bigger an object is that is an emissive object, the more kind of diffuse the lighting becomes. And we've lost some of the detail of our landscape here. We want this to be a bit sharper. So the only way we can do that is to reduce the size of this geometry of this spline mesher. But remember, we've cached the spline mesher, so it's kind of fixed as it is. But actually, the spline mesher is meshing the trail. And the trail's already cached. So what we could do is, look, let's just delete the cache tag from the spline mesher. Just delete that out. It's disappeared because we don't have the trail active. So let's activate that trail again. Now the spline mesher is live and we can make adjustments. So in the spline mesher, let's go to the object tab and let's just go and put our size down to maybe, let's reduce the size of it, which will make it much sharper, the light that's being emitted from it. Okay, so now that is done, let's re-simulate. Yeah, so now look, we've got a sharper, much thinner piece of geometry. We're getting fewer glints of it in our crystals, but that kind of makes it more contrast, our scene, and the effects on the ground aren't as great. Excellent. We can make some more adjustments. Obviously we don't want it to be white, so let's go to the Emission material, and let's make this, we'll give this a nice blue color. That's how it was in the render. So something like a nice darkish blue, but then we want it to be much kind of brighter and hotter. So now we've done that, let's increase the strength up to maybe try 4. So now we're getting this, that's maybe too much. Let's go to 3. That's looking nice. In fact, I think we could go, let's try up to 6. And the brighter we go here, we're going to get a very bright hot spot where it's close to it, but then as it as the light falls off, it gets a darker blue, which looks pretty cool. What we could do is, look, maybe go up to even strength of 15, which is really quite bright, but then we could try reducing the size. I think that's too much. Let's go down to our 7, and we'll go to our color, and let's just remove some of that saturation. Something like that is looking cool, and we'll move this through a bit. So now that we've got that going on, we could perhaps, I think arguably we could even go thinner with our spline mesher. Let's go back to the first frame, and the spline mesher we're going to go down even smaller, 0.5, and let's just play this through. Yeah, that's looking nice. Now, we can adjust our lighting glints a little bit now. Let's go to our first light, and let's just raise it up a bit and see if we can just encourage a few more of these nice orangey highlights. Yep, that's looking good. All right, and obviously you can mess around and play with that until you're happy with the look, but I'm pleased with that. So now what we're going to do is, let's just make even more room here so we're seeing the whole kind of frame here. Let's move forward a few more frames. It's looking nice. Now we're just going to get a nice area to focus in on. So we'll go to our camera, we'll go to the camera tag, and in the aperture radius, this is in the settings, we can add maybe 0.05 radius in the aperture, which has really blown it out. So now we need to pick a focal point. So let's go to our camera, object tab, focus distance. We can take the picker and then pick an area which we want to be in focus. Let's pick this crystal here, click. So now we've focused in on this, and as this render cleans up and goes through those samples, we're going to get this really cool kind of crystal look. And the more this cleans up, the more it goes through these samples, this area of light is going to get cleaned up, and it will start revealing some of that nice underlying detail of our terrain. But that is the basic way to set up the crystal look in Cycles 4D, and you can see by just using just 2 very simple lights and what is effectively a simple material, we can get this really nice stylized look.